The first few jobs were out of pity, mostly. Nobody ever really needs a medium, supportive types, friends of family, and family of friends. I wanted to be above that sort of thing, but the reality is I was not. Not that I'm unappreciative of support. It's the times when I have to follow up with people who I know really don't want to be followed up with and are only too timid to say so in person, having to plow past the overt signs of disinterest. The money was there. They just would give it to me if I was willing to take it from them. But I felt like I was paying each time with like a piece of my soul. I suppose my discomfort here is what makes me a bad businesswoman. These wishy-washy people pleaser pushover types must be like chum in the water for folks with something to sell and fewer, let's call them scruples. I refuse to do porn, and I refuse to do anything you might look at and call, quote, real work, unquote. Lazy and principled. That's me. I allow myself the luxury of living with this contradiction by being, sometimes in necessary cases, marginally more lax on my third principle, which regards accepting or, in some uncommon cases, soliciting money and other miscellaneous aid from parents and other family. What can I say? You live the life you were granted. Life's like a lazy river for everyone in the end, whether you want to sit in a tube or try to swim upstream. Ultimately, whatever you do is the path of least resistance, because you wouldn't stand to do anything else, or you would choose to do that instead. We're creatures of comfort, is what I'm trying to say. The bummer of it all was that I didn't really believe in a single thing I was doing, so I couldn't even really feel good about the gigs with the totally earnest, totally excited, true believers either. Whoops. My one solace was that it made for some of the best acting practice I ever had. I was realizing right around then how much I'd taken school for granted. Before I started doing readings as Miss Fowl, I hadn't done a scene or even picked up a script in almost 3 months. There was one real desperate stretch of about a week where I seriously contemplated doing a student film for a colleague of an acquaintance of a friend, I think. If I had a fourth principle, it would be no more student films. Trust me. The makeup, though, that was my favorite part. I think the makeup was honestly why I kept doing Miss Fowl for so long. I quickly had the basic look down to a science, but I like to spend a half an hour in front of the mirror experimenting and embellishing. The dress is something from Goodwill, and I just gussied it up with some sequins and jewels. I usually tried to park down the block or around the corner whenever possible. I know most people would never think anything of it, but I just couldn't justify a paying customer seeing Miss Fowl, divine seer into the great dark and master of the mysteries of the universe, climbing out of a filthy Honda CR-V. Rear view dreamcatcher, full ashtray, backseat full of empty Diet Coke cans. It just didn't fit the character. And if I had that first impression nagging at me the whole time, I'd never really be able to get into character. Divination as an art, sort of as a rule, is asking a lot, suspension of disbelief wise. So the performer's confidence as a bedrock has to be 100% bulletproof, or the rest of it doesn't stand a chance. You have to rationalize these things sometimes, or it was a part of my process anyways. A lot of my acting coaches have said that I think too much, but I think a few too many people in this industry could stand to do a little more thinking, frankly. But I digress. The performance, the show started at the first phone call. It was about maintaining the character and the mystique at every moment, which is why close friends and other first-degree personal connections were always typical clients. They could smile politely and play their part and sit through the whole act, but they knew I was playing a character. It was corrupted right from the start. It was like we both would have preferred that they just gave me the money, but neither of us could say it, so we had to sit through a half hour of mutual torture as punishment. This is why I would have preferred my own space over traveling door to door. The ability to bring people into my environment to heighten the show, the aura, but I couldn't bring people to my parents' house for that. And the thought of starting an LLC or signing a lease for my medium business made my blood run cold. I was good at it, or I was by the end anyways, but it was always a temporary measure. First time out was with one of my mother's friends from her book club, Francine. She lived in a big house. I had to buzz at the gate. Like, that's how big this house was. Her husband was out of town, and she said she'd never been able to do this if he was around. The main thing I remember about that day is that she totally believed in the supernatural and occult process. It was only that she pretty openly doubted my ability to access them sufficiently, which is fair. I left thinking, why hire me then, you old bat? Next time, just do your own reading. She was, however, the only person I've ever met like that. The whole thing really took off and started seeming viable when my friend Lucy hooked me up with her grandma, Connie, who was living out in the old folks' home a few towns over. She'd developed a rich social life since moving there, and I wondered if she also had been popular and well-liked in high school. If I could see one of her yearbook photos, I could probably tell you, but I bet that she was. Most folks, in my experience, don't get up to much real fundamental changing once they leave high school. They just kind of find the people and careers and lifestyles that fit their particular grooves and maybe sand down some of their own edges a bit, or have them sanded down by the world around them. And eventually the hormones subside. I got a lot of glares and a lot of side-eye stares from some residents around the cafeteria and around the rec room. I had the sense that they felt a lot like Francine did. Like, they are so intimately familiar with death themselves. Why would they want to entertain the musings and insights of some cute 20-something girl who didn't even know what she didn't know? Which is understandable. But I did, if nothing else, know that I didn't know what I didn't know. Which wasn't much, but also wasn't, in my opinion, nothing. And I would never know for sure how they felt about me because none of them ever enlisted my services. And every last resident that did turned out to be a real delight, even if a lot of them were just humoring me. Many of them became regulars. I think they just enjoyed the company, which was fine. It wasn't glamorous, but they sustained me for a few years. There was one woman, though, named Celia. I remember her in my head by her sweaters. Like, I call her Celia sweaters. They were usually seasonal or holiday themed, but her clothing was always so much more forward than she was. It took her a few months to even approach me. Meanwhile, many of the other girls on her floor had been seeing me on a weekly basis. But then Celia never talked to many of the other residents very much. The first few times she met with me, it was in the common room, at a table, in front of the vending machines. But one day, she called and left a voicemail and asked if we could hold our next meeting in her room. It was probably early October, and all of the trees in the courtyard were dropping those helicopter leaves. The building was originally a ritzy ballroom and hotel, the nicest one in town back in the 50s and 60s. They say Muhammad Ali, Fidel Castro, and Richard Nixon all stayed there. An omnipresent visual stench of the medicinal had suffused into all of the rooms and halls, plus it did just smell like old people. The luxurious bones of the place were still the thing that caught your eye. Like when I walked into Celia's room and realized it was a corner room with crown molding and a wraparound corner window overlooking the river where it met the sea. She was 4 stories up and could see most of the busy section of the little downtown district from her reading chair. She had a picture of the 1994 Dallas Cowboys offensive line carrying a supine Emmitt Smith, sponsored by Bud Light. It was hanging right above her antique little end table with the stained glass lamp and doilies. Outside the window, the sky was so blue it would make your head start to spin if you looked at it too deeply. There were maybe a dozen shoppers and out-of-towners moving between stores with their bags. Celia was scowling at them. I don't even think she noticed she was doing it. I think it was just a habit she fell into while her mind was occupied elsewhere. I asked her if she'd like to have her palms read like normal. She almost looked like she'd forgotten I was there. She said that she wanted to communicate with the dead and asked me if that was something I could do. Well, I did happen to have my Ouija board in my bag. I was relieved to find that I'd at least thought to take the shrink wrap off of it. She drew the long curtain shut, and I took several candles from my bag and lit them, then lit a stick of incense. She kept her eyes closed through the whole setup, kept her breathing very intentional. I took her hands in mine and said some stuff about opening up a portal and keeping ourselves protected, and then asked her who she was hoping to contact on the other side. Molly Wendell, she said. She exhaled. I warned her that it took a lot of intense concentration and energy for anything to cross between realms, that the type of stuff you saw in the movies was usually just for the movies, that often it was all a spirit could do to move the planchette between yes and no. She nodded once, very solemnly. I asked if there was anyone in the room with us, kind of winging my performance, piecing it together from various half memories of movies and sleepovers. The climate control did me a solid, flickering the candles. Just a slight chill, the sort of thing you only notice when you're very tuned into everything else. Then someone a block over laid on their horn, and it was all a wash. I could feel her fingers next to mine, warm on the plastic, her heart breathing in the dark. There was a golden Edward Hopper quality to the light that snuck in between the curtains. All of a sudden, the planchette moved. Or I moved it, maybe? I honestly couldn't say for sure if you put my hand on a Bible and hooked me up to a lie detector. There'd been a twitchy electricity running down my fingers, but that was inevitable. All of the energy in the room was focused on this one little piece of plastic. I hadn't meant to, but at the same time, it felt as if my fingers were tuned in closer than usual to the stream of my thoughts, watching them go by, like a brown bear watching a salmon, waiting for the right one, ready to grab it before my higher cortexes could step in. Celia gasped. Squealed. My heart sank. I waited for something to happen, for it to move again. The clock in the room was ticking at the volume you would watch TV. It wasn't moving. Nothing was moving. I realized that all my muscles were tensed. Was I preventing it from moving? I tried to relax. Celia spoke. "Are you there, Molly? It's me, Celia." Her voice was like a cloud of cool mist on a summer day, something in the way she said it so vulnerable and sincere. It landed like ice on my chest. I tried to feel the planchette, really feel it. I focused on being open, on transmitting. I thought of the river flowing with energy. I thought as hard as I could think, but it was just dead plastic. Still, the board was glossy. Celia's hands were frail, and I even thought I detected something of a tremor out of the corner of my eye. So, I don't know, would I feel worse taking her money for nothing? Or for a lie? I nudged it. Luckily, I didn't really have time to wonder whether or not I made the right choice. The little involuntary squeak I heard catch in her throat, she put her hand to her mouth for just a split second, like she was trying to grab it, told me instantly. Turns out I hadn't. But I was already committed to a path. I opened my eye enough to peek through and see her starting to tear up, biting her lip, definitely trembling. I nudged it over to yes, and I thought she might pass out. But she composed herself. "You remember me?" she asked. I noticed that my hand was trembling now too, a little bit, not on purpose. I pushed the thing around in jerky little circles, and I could hear Celia start to cry, just a tiny little sputter before she corralled it back in, just a sniffle. I rubbed her hand sympathetically with my pinky, and her skin felt like paper. I stopped the thing abruptly. I'd gotten so caught up in the whole thing, I wasn't even trying to be subtle, but I don't think she noticed. Quickly dabbed her tears and affected a stiff upper lip, and then waited. I waited with her. It must have been minutes. I would have been sweating it out more, but for the absolute calm that I could feel radiating from Celia across the table. But it was only a calm, not a satisfaction. It took me about 5 minutes to realize this. She was like a woman in a fur coat in the department store, waiting for all of her purchases to be gift wrapped. Patient, but expectant. But it wasn't me who moved at that time. I swear, I can't honestly tell you if it was her or something else, but it took both of our breaths away. Frankly, if it were up to me, I could have waited her out. I had nothing else planned. Let her leave a little disappointed, leave them wanting more, save something for the next time. But whatever was moving took us very squarely onto the S. And then nothing. It left us hanging. Once again, and this time, not by my choosing, but once again, nevertheless, I was committed to a path. 6 semesters of improv really does just teach you in many ways about strategically turning off your brain. For little blurts here and there, stuff your forebrain would be too full of trepidation to commit to. So in some ways, you can say the whole game of it is the conscious trying to react, really, to the subconscious. Like turning around and immediately having a ball thrown at you, trying to chase down whatever weird burp comes up and wrangle it over to this world of stuff that, nominally makes sense, I guess. I felt some force guiding me to guide us over to the right, over the T, towards the U. Then my eye caught the W, and I knew exactly what it was going to do. She furrowed her brow, and when we hit it, I pulled us back up to the left. We drifted over the E, paused at the A. I slipped down to T, back to E, then R. She really did pass out. She slumped right out of her chair and knocked her head on the coffee table. I was trying to extinguish all of the candles and collect the sage as the nurses were reviving her and bandaging her head. If I thought I was getting glares before. She called me up that night to tell me she was okay. She still had one of Molly's sweaters in her drawer. She was knitting it herself. She wanted to schedule another appointment, same time the following week. The next morning, I woke up to my phone ringing from a number I didn't know. And when I hung up 3 minutes later, I'd booked the largest gig of my young career to that point. Jessica Birch was throwing a Halloween party. She'd rented out McCabe Manor for the occasion, the one-time mayoral mansion and current oldest building in town. These days, they use it as the Town Historical Society and Museum. She wanted me to do a guided seance. Jessica and I graduated the same year, but K through 12, we maybe spoke all of 30 words to each other. I did not ask how she'd heard of me, as in Miss Fowl, and was honestly a little bit surprised to find out that she even knew who I was. Sarah Fowler, 4 rows behind her in pre-calc. She asked what my rate was and preempted my answer, which I didn't have, to say, would like $15K be enough? I nearly choked. I said, yeah, that should be fine. She had just spent several months helping her sister plan a wedding in Sicily, and it showed. It sounded like she had a clipboard in her other hand. It wouldn't be a very large party, she said. Only a few dozen people were invited. Very exclusive, I said out loud for some reason. Celia's head was in a bandage when I saw her next. She said that luckily she didn't need stitches. She was terribly afraid of needles. I asked her if she wanted to try to contact Molly again. She said no. Just a palm reading then? She shook her head. Have you ever done tarot? I asked. I'm sorry, she said. I guess I should have called you to cancel. I woke up feeling strange and haven't been able to shake it all morning. Strange how? I asked. Bad dream. Weird dream, I guess. I asked her what it was about. She said, I was in here like normal. Maybe that's why it sticks with me so hard, because it feels so normal. It's impossible to tell at first that it's a dream. Hard to dream about anywhere else these days when I seldom leave this room. I've always had a hard time escaping my physical surroundings, even in dreams. I'm jealous of folks who seem to go to Africa or Europe at will. I'm usually watching television or knitting something. It feels like it's probably after breakfast. Then at some point I hear a great sucking sound from outside. I interjected, "You've had this dream before?" "Every night this week," she responded. I go out to the window, and the first thing I notice every time is that the beach is just gone. Then I see the foam on the concrete, and I realize what's happening, sloshing up around the tires of cars parked on the street. It's a whole reorientation that's happening in your brain. Such a thing as simple as seeing water where it shouldn't be, and it's so disorienting, dream or not. I got so dizzy once I woke up, I had to run to the bathroom to throw up. A couple minutes later in the dream, it already starts to smell more fishy in my apartment, and I look out the window and the roads look like rivers. The cars are floating away. Water is all I can see all the way to the horizon. The ocean looks like columns of an enemy army advancing. The curious thing is, there's nobody in the halls. I'll stick my head out and check everyone's doors, but they're all shut. I can't hear any sort of panic or evacuation happening anywhere. In fact, it's downright silent, which shouldn't be the case, even on a normal day. All you can hear is the roaring of the water echoing through the elevator shafts. I looked outside the window. The ocean was still where it should have been, but she resumed her story. Pretty soon, it starts sounding like it's raining, but it's not. That's just the droplets splashing up from the current. Whenever I look next, the waves are up and around the second-story windows, like I'm on the deck of a boat. After that, I go and sit on my couch and wait for the electricity to fail, which doesn't usually take very long. I hardly notice it with the daylight still coming in the windows. "You never try to run?" I ask. "To escape?" She only shrugged. "Run where?" Outside, the sun was shining. But she went on. "It's a gray day, and I think at some point it even starts raining. It's late afternoon when the water starts sloshing outside my window without going away. That's the scary part that sets the conceptual matter of the thing into the reality section of your spine, just seeing it sitting there, the top of it at the bottom of the window. At first, it's just clear, totally clear, a couple liters of water, as you know it, something familiar, comfortable, something you could drink. But you can watch it rise with your eyes. Second by second, it just keeps coming, and soon it's something else. Soon it's green and murky and full of particles. Soon it's the ocean. I watch as the sky goes away. It takes another hour. I watch as the last sliver of it is filled in, and then I look around my apartment as the light slowly fades. I listen to the building and I hear creaking, the stress of metal and concrete, like we're on a submarine, but no people. I remember in my dream I saw a crab float by the window. She stopped a moment and looked around the room. It sounds different in here when it's underwater, you know? It's quieter. Everything sounds like being under the blanket with your friend, up late at a sleepover. Do you know that feeling? I told her I did. My eyes adjust to the gloom, and then real night comes, and that's when it gets dark. At night, I feel like I can hear every single bolt and piece of rebar in the building groaning and sighing. About a week before Jessica's party, I received an email from a woman named Connie Jam, representing the Historical Society. She invited me to come down anytime during business hours for a tour, to give me some background and insider knowledge for my group seance. I stopped in at lunch the following day, my schedule as a freelance witch with half a bachelor's degree being what it is. There were 3 ladies to greet me, and they all seemed pretty happy to see me. Connie, of course, along with Lila and Suzanne. None of them younger than 60. Lila took me on a quick tour of the gardens, very evidently her own pet project. I told her they were marvelous, and they genuinely were. Stepping into the house, Connie gave me a rundown. Built in 1630 by William McCabe, one of the founders of the town and by far the richest man during his life. He died heirless in 1674. Lila jumped in to help and donated this house to the town for use as a mayoral mansion. 36 mayors have lived in this house, but it was second, Lionel Beecher, inducted in 1690, who was its most famous resident. She told me the dining hall where the seance was to take place. There were tapestries hung high on the walls. The house has belonged to almost all of the town's most prominent families at one point or another throughout its history, said Connie. In the next room, the smoking room, Lila pointed out the window to a shed in the back. That was originally used as an ice house in the summers, she said. There was a butter churn in the kitchen next to a little placard and a mannequin wearing pilgrim clothes. The bulk of their art collection was upstairs. Suzanne spoke now for the first time. There's no shortage of wealth that's passed through the town over the years. Plenty of patrons of the arts types, and Helm's Corner has always managed to inspire a sense of civic pride. Hard not to feel proud of a place that looks like this, right? Of course, that's not to mention all of the artists who seem to be drawn here for one reason or another. There were painters in residence, painters who made great careers just painting Helm's Corner. They came over from Europe for the purpose 100 years before anyone knew where Hudson River was, blah, blah, blah. There were busts and small sculptures on pedestals throughout the hallway, oil paintings lining the wall. We passed a room of old furniture, one with boxes and one with tall shelves lined with files and records. The carpets were plush and silent. We passed a long, dark hallway, and I saw something out the corner of my eye that put my heart in my throat. I stopped abruptly. There was a painting at the end of the hall. It was only a painting. The woman wore black fur and was life-size, maybe ever so slightly larger, shrouded in shadow, staring at me. Margaret Beecher, said Suzanne, Lionel's wife. Her coat was long. It melted into the dark. The brim of a big black hat framed her face like a dark halo. Doesn't look very Puritan, I said. They didn't think so either, said Suzanne. Her features were sharp, and her gaze was even sharper. She was not young, but she was clearly beautiful. Have you ever heard it called Margaret's house before? Asked Connie. I said that I hadn't. It was going out of style when we were young, but back in the day, that's what a lot of the folks who lived here swore it was called. The nickname stuck around for a while. We came back to where we began, and they asked if I had any questions. A part of me hates to even ask, I said. I'm sure it's all anyone wants to talk about, but is it true? They really hanged 5 women right in the yard? They all smiled. It's not entirely true, said Lila. Margaret was crushed to death. Suzanne spoke. They heard about what was happening in Salem, and I guess sometimes an idea can spread just like a virus. Over there, it was mostly about land and petty family grudges, which doesn't paint anyone too good of a light, but here it was about keeping up with what they were doing over in Salem. So, I asked if it would be all right if I took a few minutes to wander around and look at the other paintings. The woman told me it would be more than all right, and they were glad someone was enjoying them. They were taking off early. We almost never stay past lunch unless there's a field trip, said Connie. And never past 3, said Lila. Connie giggled. The door will lock behind you, so just make sure it closes. Suzanne smiled at me on their way out. I did a quick tour of all the other rooms we hadn't seen. Truth be told, though there were some interesting paintings that at any other time would have taken up a lot of my attention, and some that I maybe even could have fallen in love with, the whole thing was little more than a formality, biding my time until I could justify returning to the Lady Margaret. It was a big house. The emptiness of the place set into my bones. There's a certain staleness in the air of some old houses, like the timber hasn't moved in hundreds of years, and the air would prefer to move as little as possible as well. Thank you very much. Things sound crisp and true, but they don't echo. No noise lingers. Now and then a floorboard squeals or moans. It's like the house reminding you that it's here. I turned the corner, this time knowing full well where I was and what was waiting. And still, she took my breath away. The reason I had asked to stay. I could hardly meet my gaze. She intimidated me across 400 years. I moved closer. She was several inches taller than me. Her hat was as floppy as her eyes were sardonic, which is to say, certainly, but not so much as to overpower the other charms and effects of the hat and face, respectively. I moved in closer, that she was towering over me now. My head could have nestled between her chin. Still, her eyes seemed to be looking at me, judging, pointedly but not unfairly, which made it all the worse. I could see that the blackness of her coat was both deeper and more complex than I could have imagined when I first laid eyes on it from down the hall. I imagined that the effect might be intentional, this taking away of the viewer's breath. I could never fully recover from the initial shock, truth be told. My heart rate came down a bit, but remained elevated for as long as I was within view of her. It gave her the upper hand in every encounter. This was wrong footing, the first move advantage without moving a muscle. I studied the portrait, but could not come up with a satisfying answer for how exactly she pulled it off. Crushed to death. The words rolled around in my mind until they lost their meaning and became a strange shape. The concept of language is very fragile. It's very easy to break the illusion that this means anything. So much depends on that illusion, right? Crushed to death? What does that even mean? A scribe had to watch that, listen to her screams, whatever sounds she made, and translate it into history. Repeatable little noises, consonants and vowels, crushed to death. What state does a person have to be in to inflict that on another person? I mean, I've been angry. I can conceive of conceptualizing it. I mean, maybe even starting it if you were really hopped up over something, but I don't know. I mean, God, as soon as you saw what it was, you would stop. Don't you think? How could you not? Whatever it was, there's another way to solve it. You'd grab the rocks back 2 at a time, 1 in each hand, and realize how fast your heart was beating and be like, oh my God, that was crazy. I mean, right? There were swirls of other colors embedded and hinted at within the blacks. They gave the fur an almost mesmerizing depth, like you could go swimming in it. I could practically feel it against my cheeks. There were worlds contained within the variance of the darkness. I don't know, it's really impossible to describe. I kind of got lost in it. There was this wonderful, almost floating sensation. That's a hell of a thing to do to your wife. I mean, what could she have done or said, or was he just such a pushover that he couldn't prevent his own wife from getting crushed to death? I mean, I feel like it's difficult to grasp who these people were through the screens of myth and legend. You know what happened generally in bullet points, but how it's hard to imagine a person doing such and such, but it's pretty easy to imagine someone you know doing it, and they'd probably have their reasons. But no, if a sitting mayor's wife dies at the hand of the court, it's because he wanted her dead. The way her hands rode the collars, coy but not cloying, confident but not overbearing, whoever had painted her had captured her in whole. It was uncanny. I wondered if it would have been someone from the community, if the artist had really known her as well as they'd made it seem. Commissioned by Lionel for her 33rd birthday, about 3 years before her death. I don't know. She'd given birth to 6 kids, and she was slender as a stick. I remember searching the black. I don't know what I was looking for, if anything. I do remember the notion that I would be rewarded somehow for my attention to detail. I don't know where it came from. I could feel her eyes, even when I wasn't looking at them, on the back of my neck, preying on me. indifferently feasting. I studied, and new details revealed themselves out of the darkness. I realized that my eyes must have been adjusting to the lower light. There was almost emotion implied in the stillness. The more you noticed it, the more the whole thing seemed to flow and come to life. There was almost a tidal, almost hypnotic effect. At some point, I realized my ears had become sort of plugged up somehow. The silence in the house had been muted or strongly muffled. It wasn't really bothersome as much as it was something I noticed. In my nose as well, sure enough. And then I began to feel a slight generalized pressure in my head, like a squeezing or a clamping almost. Nothing more serious than the feeling of a loved one simply gripping your head, maybe to kiss you on the forehead or something, but within a couple of seconds it intensified, and pretty quickly it did feel like a vice was operating on my skull. Though still, to be honest, not so bothersome, at least not in the state I was in, like the metal claws were covered with a dish towel. But it was certainly something I noted, and noted that it was probably something to be concerned about, as it only kept drawing tighter with each passing second. There was no pain, but it felt like there ought to be, and likely could be at any moment. A pressure building in my head, building and building past the point of impossibility, and further still, and nothing I could do to alleviate it. Nothing at all, just squeezing heavier and heavier and heavier until I hear a light, high-pitched squeaking and then a great resounding crack, splintering like a tall old tree falling in a forest, like a rupture. I looked around. I was sweating a bit and I was cold. Through the window, I could see that it was night, but that was not something my mind would accept. The moon had risen and was a thin, orangey crescent, and the sky was almost purplish. I began immediately hunting for some reason why it was nighttime. There was an eclipse, a tornado was coming, the rods and cones in my eyes were malfunctioning. All seemed more likely than it actually being night, even after I checked my phone and saw that it was after 8:30? Maybe I had taken mushrooms and forgot. That would explain the sweatiness and the hallucinating. But I sat for a moment and thought and checked and found that I was not on mushrooms. Where had the last 7 hours gone? Sure, I was enraptured by the painting and I could see losing 15 or even 30 minutes studying it, but for the love of God, I had expected my feet to start aching after an hour. I don't remember a thing except for the painting and how it had made me feel. Last I could remember, I'd been thinking of my drive home and wondering if I could justify an iced coffee on the way. 7 hours? The thought of it was putting a pit in my stomach. The entire afternoon and early evening, just for me, did not exist. It made the house seem suddenly very scary because in all that time, it seemed like danger could have poured in behind my back to fill in all of these big empty rooms. Suddenly, I couldn't bear to be within the sight of the Lady Margaret. Nothing in her had changed as far as I could tell, but to my nerves, the ones beyond my control, she had become positively dreadful, absolutely intolerable, like passing by a cave and smelling human flesh rotting inside. I couldn't leave the place fast enough. I saw Celia the day before the seance, but only briefly. I went to her apartment at our usual time, and she seemed surprised to see me, but she welcomed me in nonetheless. She offered to make me some tea. I asked her if she wanted a palm reading, and she asked if I wanted to give her one. She said that she had forgotten about our appointment and that she meant to cancel, but I probably shouldn't count on her as a customer going forward. She hoped I wouldn't be too hurt. I said I wasn't. I thought about it a lot after we contacted Molly, she said. It kept me up more than a few nights. And in the end, I wasn't really sure what to think about it. I thought about it so much. Do you ever have that happen? I nodded. But the other day, I remembered something my mother told me once when I was young. And for one reason or another, I remembered it all my life. I remembered thinking about it a lot because I never really felt like I got what she was trying to say. I know there's more to the world than what we can see, she would say, but I'm starting to think we can't never look at it in the eye. Celia looked at me congenially. Let's not look directly at it. I don't think we're meant to. Maybe for a good reason. The skies outside were gray and roiling, the water all foam and churning. I'm starting to think maybe that's what death is. Looking it in the eye. I offered to help guide her. Sarah, you're a very nice girl, she said. But when I'm ready to look, I'm not sure how much guidance you'll have to offer me. No offense. It started raining on my drive home. I checked my phone when I arrived and realized I'd been added to a huge group chat for the party. Skimming, I gleaned, among many other things, that Jessica's Aunt Catherine would be in attendance, in town from LA, where she worked as an agent for one of the most prestigious talent agencies because she loved New England in the fall. Most of the people in the chat agreed that it was nice. None of the ladies who'd shown me around the week prior were there when I arrived at the house on Friday night. The party had already started, but I found Jessica and she showed me to her party coordinator, who showed me where I could set up. A few of the faces looked familiar, but I couldn't place names and nobody stopped to talk to me. One, I realized, was definitely Sydney Hucker from high school. She'd been the spelling and geography bee champion, valedictorian, and easygoing enough to be the one nerd accepted amongst the cool and rich and stoner kids that Jessica ran with. And I could have sworn another one might have been Bella Jewell, a country singer who became wildly popular a few summers ago off her first album and hasn't been heard from ever since. I do still have a lot of those songs in my workout playlist, though. I finished setting up and couldn't find the coordinator to tell her, but nobody seemed to be congregating or moving in my direction, so I snuck off to visit with the Lady Margaret. She was, of course, as and where I left her. Of course, obviously, she's a painting. The effect was still powerful, though I will admit diminished a bit by the presence of all those other people milling about and laughing and generally treating the place like a frat house. She seemed vulnerable somehow, out of her element, but she'd never show it. I must have heard my name somewhere amidst the babble because something perked up in my brain. When I returned to the main area of the home, the party had quieted significantly. Most of the guests were gathered around the long table, waiting on me. My seat with the high back was still open in the middle. A dozen people sat down on either side of me and across, and the rest stood behind and filled in. I clocked Aunt Catherine sitting toward the end of the table, closest to the smoking room. There weren't very many folks over the age of 45 present. She seemed to be having a good time, though. Someone standing behind me said, "You guys shut up. The bird's going to do her ghosty thing." Oh, man. There it was. A little hunk of my brain, probably the size of a thumbprint, that hadn't lit up since high school graduation. I'd grown out of some of the more exaggerated pubescent features, in my opinion anyways, which had made the name such an easy and devastating nickname, and certain other qualities had caught up to round out my countenance in a way that I and plenty of others, trust me, found perfectly nice and not in any way particularly avian. I didn't have much else to show for it, but I did feel that leaving for college and those 2 years away at school provided me with a clean sense of a break, a separation between myself and the town and the people who had stayed, a chance to pack everything up to that point in a box and label it childhood and slide it under the bed. Making choices about myself away from the people I'd known my whole life, becoming a person amongst people who didn't know who I was and mostly didn't seem to care. Allowing wounds to scab and scabs to heal, an uncontaminated environment in which new biases could take root and a personality could grow. It's kind of remarkable, looking back at it, to see how much of myself, the person I think of as me, was discovered and established in just those 2 years. Someone kind of guffawed, and that's the best word I could use for it. People did indeed shut up, some snickering. I could feel their eyes on me, and I avoided all of them. Their combined intensity was baking me. I tried not to think about how red my face must have been. "Hi, everyone," I said. "I'm Miss Fell." I heard someone breathe out of their nose. And welcome to the historic and haunted, allegedly, McCabe Manor. I will be your evening's guide on a spiritual journey, and we will attempt to contact the invisible forces residing in this place and maybe, if we're lucky, converse with some of the people who have resided here in the past. In my pause to catch my breath, I heard the silence. I looked around and saw everyone still looking at me, and for a second I wasn't sure I'd be able to speak again. But I found the words and pulled the first of them out of my throat, and the rest just followed like a clown's endless handkerchief. This task, as you may imagine, is incredibly difficult and not without danger. It requires focus and delicate balance of concentration and open-mindedness from everyone in the room. To begin, I'd like us all to take a moment in silence to notice our own breathing. Take the hand of the person next to you in your own. Feel the energy of your surroundings. Reach out. Explore the house. Be honest about what you're feeling. What is out there? What is the atmosphere of this place? Tune in. I let there be silence for the space of about 10 seconds. No one was snickering or whispering anymore. In the light of these candles, in drawing this sigil upon this table, I open up a portal. I continued. In the light of these candles, in drawing this sigil in chalk upon this table, I open up a portal across the veil. We would like to invite Margaret Beecher, if you are present and willing, to join us. I now detected some whispering, but it was of a good sort. I waited for help from the environment. I found that it was almost always forthcoming if you were patient enough to sweat it out, that these sorts of air currents and temperature fluctuations and odd creaks and moanings from the house were always happening on a rolling basis, and it was just a matter of where your attention was. The house was the star of the show, after all. People tend to overestimate how much of the show happens on the stage with these things, at least the good ones. A lot of it takes place privately, inside everyone's own minds. That's where the good locations do the heavy lifting. Folks come into a place like this ready to pop the first time they feel a cold breeze on their neck. They're hearing the whole sad sack life story every time the pipes are upset. I will admit that at first I was quite intimidated by the size of this group, but I found it was actually easier to keep 40-ish people waiting in silence for a couple of minutes than it is to wait with one or two people. The fact that everyone else is waiting alongside you is this social reassurance. The fact of everyone else's assumed belief in me actually made me feel more powerful in all of the other individuals sitting there. A brilliant, inevitable circle, self-fulfilling prophecy, infinite energy hack, as long as they assumed everyone else believed in me. I found myself suddenly on this tightrope of assumed belief. At first, it was a bit dizzying, and it was all I could do to catch myself. But I tried to go on. We are gathered here in your dining room, full of love and empathy, looking to hear your story. It wasn't much, but it was enough to break the silence, which I could feel teetering dangerously close to sighing and snickering. Suddenly, someone's chair squeaked, and someone else gasped. It wasn't much, and I don't think I was the only one who realized as much, but it was kind of loud, and the tension was such that it was enough, in the quiet, to make a few people's hearts skip. The little communal laughter that resulted reaffirmed that the group was still bought in. I could hear the relief, which hinted at some real genuine jitters happening beneath the surface. If you couldn't pierce people's initial walls somewhere, then you never had a chance. If you are with us tonight, Margaret, please provide us with a sign. A cold wind found its way into the coal bin in the basement. A moment later, the candles on the table flickered and even threatened to extinguish, though I couldn't feel any sort of breeze where I was sitting. I could feel the genuine fear now radiating from the audience, though to some extent it was difficult to separate their feelings from my own. I was not immune to the house's effects. Oh my God, said someone. They didn't yell. They spoke at a normal conversational volume, and my eardrums felt like they might cave from it. The person to my right squeezed my hand very hard. I looked around and couldn't see anything out of the ordinary until someone pointed up. And then I saw the chandelier. It was hard to tell for sure in the flickering light of all those candles playing on that crystal, but it sure did seem to be moving. Mind you, I am not the Fox sisters. I've got no complex system of knocks, no lever and pulley system happening beneath the floor, mostly because I could never bear the thought of being found out and directly confronted, even in my imagination. I much prefer to live in the gray world of improv and bullshit, to always leave myself some sort of rhetorical wiggle space. I had no idea what the hell was happening either. I took a glance at Aunt Catherine. She was smiling, but she didn't seem at all unnerved. I took a deep breath, and then I began to moan. Quietly, at first, almost beneath my breath, so that I wasn't even sure if the people whose hands I was holding could hear. But then louder and louder. It wasn't long before I could tell that I had everyone's absolute attention. I managed to add a full body tremor for good effect and rolled my eyes back into my head. Who is this? Who has summoned me? The resounding silence felt like hitting a brick wall doing 45. Nobody from the group would volunteer if not directly addressed. They'd all default to inaction and let me handle the hot potato I'd stupidly grabbed for myself. Maybe that'd been the plan. Maybe I'd been the sacrificial lamb all along. I saw the thought leak in like a poison, and I knew that I needed to snuff it out, but I could not. It felt too biologically true in that moment until Jessica spoke up, and probably mostly in the interest of saving her party, saved me. Hi, my name's Jessica. These are my friends, and we're celebrating Halloween. In my house? I said. I didn't think the words. They simply left my throat. Thank you so much for having us, she said. I heard a little giggle, and I shuddered. She'd rescued me out of the fire and was about to smother me with her charm. Why, I whined, did you disturb me? Someone across the room spoke. Is it true that you were crushed to death? I saw my opportunity and I took it. I started whimpering and shaking and quickly worked up that into screaming and convulsing, shrieking, only to make sure that I didn't take it so far that someone felt the need to step in and interrupt me for my own personal health. I didn't have them yet, but I could feel them still within my reach, like fish still curious of the bait. Help! I cried. It's heavy, so heavy. I reached out. I even flung myself across the table for good measure. Oh, God, I said. And then a very curious thing happened. I say curious here to mean candidly, the scariest thing that has ever happened to me in my entire life. Possibly the only real scary thing that I have ever experienced in hindsight. Taken in context, everything else seems like a hand-sock puppet theater act. I felt a heavy hand on the back of my head, nearly big enough to wrap halfway around it, as real as the wood of the table it pinned me to. I felt a boot on my back, nearly 3/4 the size of my back. I thought, at least I have their attention. Then something flat and hard, wood, laid atop my back and the back of my head. Oh, God, I said. I turned my head so I could see Aunt Catherine. She seemed mostly confused. I heard the clink of a basketball-sized stone. Then I felt it. It did not weigh so much on its own, diffused by the board, but it set my heart beating so hard that I thought the rock might start jumping and clattering around. I screamed again as I had no words. Some people recorded. Please help me, Jesus Christ, I said, and a pair of stones came down, one after another. They knocked the breath out of me. What's happening? said someone. I couldn't believe they didn't hear the rocks. Another couple came down. These ones right above my head. My forehead hit the table. Someone asked if I was all right. Jesus, I said. Another rock. They must have had a small pyramid going by now. I could hardly feel each individual new addition. The solid old mahogany dining table was unforgiving against my ribs. My eyes were watering. It felt as though I was being juiced. I think someone said, "Should we help her?" But everything sounded all muffled and the world was blurry. My lungs worked and struggled, but breathing soon became almost impossible. Anything other than the shortest and feeblest of breaths. I felt my organs touching up against different organs they'd never touched, like an overstuffed balloon in a vice. More rocks piled on. The momentum became inevitable as all of this empty space inside of me filled and my bones weakened. More rocks, the weight advancing more and more. The rocks wanted to occupy the space that I did. The most basic laws of the universe were in command. I felt all of this as sure as I am speaking to you now. The last thing that I could hear beside an incessant, whiny, squeaking noise, my face pressed to the table with my tongue stuck out like a fattened pig, was the far-off clatter of each successive rock piled atop the stack. They must have been 5 feet high by now. They sounded a mile away. They were laughing. When I came to, they were laughing. I don't know how long had passed, but the weight was gone. It was all that I could do to fill my lungs with oxygen. I tried to lift my chest off the table, but my arms were too weak. I was sweating and my temples were throbbing. Aunt Catherine was standing behind Jessica with her hand on her shoulder, speaking something into her ear. She was carrying her purse and looked annoyed. Someone started a sarcastic round of applause that became genuine at some point, and in the midst, I saw Aunt Kay leave. I couldn't even gather enough of my voice to stop her. Then someone started playing Thriller, and the lights came up, and the party moved on. Later that night, coming out of the bathroom, Jessica cornered me and said, "We all appreciate your commitment and the, performance, but I'm not going to lie, for the prices you charge, I sort of expected to actually experience some form of communication with the dead. Do you understand? It's fine. It is what it is at this point, but I just thought you should know. Some people maybe feel a little cheated." I told her I was sorry that she felt that way, but she was already looking at her phone. It appeared that I'd been deleted from her Real People to Pay Attention to Rolodex the second she'd said what she needed to say. I didn't have much interest in hanging around the party as a mascot who didn't really know anyone there, so I got in my car and I headed for home. It was very foggy out. I imagined slamming head on into every pair of headlights that whipped around the bend from out of nowhere. I couldn't see the ocean, but I could feel it nearby. I walked through my front door a little after 10 and put a pot of water on the stove to make a box of mac and cheese. I could sleep in tomorrow. That was something. I had a birthday party booked next week that I wanted to cancel but had no good reason to. And nothing beyond that. This one would float me through, at least for a little while. I fell into the couch and turned on the TV. I was asleep before the water reached a boil.